Open up, Sergeant.
My experts had considered all the possibilities, methodically, and I thought accurately. Over and over, we discussed the strength, actual and potential, of our probable enemies. France, confused and helpless in the hands of fascist leaders. England, weak, frightened, citadel of appeasement. The United States, no army, navy, or air force. My expert in that country gave me most satisfactory reports.
I think it is a mistake to underestimate America, Herr Eberlein.
Do you question my statistics?
All I know is that the United States is the industrial phenomenon of the world.
I'll stick to my figures, Herr Schloss. To win wars, you need manpower. We know how many men the United States can put into the field. This number is limited by the number of men necessary for production of the materiel with which to fight. The ratio of workers to soldiers is fixed.
Herr Eberlein, have you ever considered the possibility of woman labor?
American women? Come. The most decadent women on the face of the earth. Let me quote you some statistics about the women of America. Last year, 1938, they spent more for cosmetics than the United States Navy did for ships. More for silk stockings than the United States Air Force spent for planes. Flirts, cocktail drinkers, pleasure lovers, loafers, a race of playgirls pampered and spoiled by their sentimental American men. How different from the women of Germany, who trained like soldiers, who bred babies to wage this war, and are now producing the goods for our grown soldiers on the fighting fronts. And all this, Herr Schloss, without lipstick. American women, bad.
This I accepted. I was to make many mistakes before my downfall, but none, however spectacular, was more grave than my contempt that day for American women. The moment was right. I invaded Poland. My war was begun. Meanwhile, in the United States, there was a restless stirring, and Land-Lease began to operate. Factories appeared overnight. How was it possible for America to achieve such production and at the same time build an army? Then the amazing reports came in from my agents in the United States. The answer was that 20% of American industrial manpower was woman power. Legions of American women were massing to stop my advance across the world, forsaking the round of revelry for the grim tasks of war. It was the first time I had heard of the hidden army.
It may have been the first time, Herr Hitler, but it was not to be the last time. The hidden army was going to haunt you till your dying day. Tomorrow, isn't it? Or the day after tomorrow. Pearl Harbor came, and we were in the war 100%. The Axis believed it was ready for us. Axis statistics, careful and accurate, had forecast this Army, this Air Force, this Navy. But in the production estimate, the axis was wrong, because the forecast had miscalculated the potential strength of the hidden army, the women of American industry. Across the Atlantic to Berlin, across the Pacific to Tokyo went news of the upheaval in American life. Millions and millions of women who had never lifted a finger outside their own homes now suddenly resolved to set the world house in order. These were the uniforms of the hidden army. These their weapons. And these the results they helped to achieve. It must have called for some pretty fancy explaining by the statistical expert, Herr Eberlein.
But Herr Eberlein, it will pass, I tell you. These women are the unemployed, the publicity seekers, the seekers after novelty, the cranks, playgirls with new toys. It's just a vogue, nothing more. It will pass.
But it did not pass. Not yet. Invasion came to North Africa. Working side by side with men, women had helped weld the landing craft that disgorged equipment and American fighting men. Women had helped rivet the planes that rained hell through the days and nights. Women had manufactured the radio tubes that flashed the news that the first major Allied invasion was accomplished triumphantly. And in doing all this, they had earned the respect of the men beside them. There were some jobs that a woman could do even better than men. Jobs, for instance, that required a delicate touch and sensitive fingers. Yes, the American woman, to every man's surprise, had won her industrial spurs. And this, in addition to about 100,000 women in the Army, Navy, and Marines, and the brave nurses risking their very lives on the battlefront. By the end of 1943, the hidden army had grown to be nearly 30% of war production labor. But by that time, all over the globe, American arms had passed from defense to offense. This meant greatly increased demands for materiel and greatly increased demands for men. Casualties had to be replaced. Invasion forces had to be built. And as our armed forces grew, so did their demands for equipment, supplies, food, materiel of all kinds. The need for women grew desperate. And thousands of women answered the call. But then a strange thing happened. One month, the hidden army, which had mushroomed, suddenly stopped growing. The following month was even more disturbing. The papers reported a slight falling off in production. Some were too tired in the morning to face the assembly line or the workbench. Some found that defense work interfered with their shopping. A few members of the hidden army, it seemed, had earned enough for the fur coat they coveted and returned to their pre-war existence. Perhaps the war news looked swell and the compulsion to work was dissipated in the confident talk of victory just around the corner. Others quit for sounder reasons. Transportation was a problem. It was distressingly difficult to be both a housekeeper and a patriot. The kids needed looking after, and the house somehow refused to run itself when 8 hours a day were spent at the plant. But by far the most common reason was that women were not accustomed to the long hours of hard work. Shortages appeared. American planes found themselves lacking bearing assemblies. Delicate parts for electronic equipment were low. And American wounded became American dead. Of a sudden, the war was right in the American home. The government regrets to inform...
No, no.
What's the matter? What's the matter?
For every American cross driven into the foreign earth, a gold star hung in some American home. Our women learned in bitter tears and heartache that in war there can be no such thing as a slight falling off in production, because there's no such thing as a slight death. By early 1944, the draft quotas were falling behind. The demands for young men for the new invasion forces were imperative. These young men had to come largely from the deferred, the fathers, those doing essential industrial work. Reclassification was called for. This at a time when stories drifted in from the cold Italian mountains, the malaria-ridden Pacific jungles, the watery graves. Women the country over began to recognize war for what it was, a grim, tough, unromantic battle to the death, in which every man, woman, and child had a stake. If the American home is to be preserved, if the tragedies of other families in tortured lands are not to be duplicated here, the Axis must be brought to its knees. The Hidden Army drew fresh recruits. Its ranks grew to nearly 18 million. Many of these women came from walks of life not previously considered. The mothers, the young, the aged. When they were asked why they had joined the ranks of the Hidden Army, these women gave a variety of reasons.
I have a daughter in the waves, and I had a son on the Arizona. That's a good enough reason for anyone.
I'm an old maid, and I didn't have anyone until I took this defense job. Now, I have a family of 10 million to look after. I send them cases of these every week to help them to get home soon.
I go to college, but I arranged my classes so that I could help out in the war effort. This way I'll get my diploma and war bonds.
I was too heavy for the wax, so I joined up in defense work. Yesterday was the big day of my life. The foreman told me I was worth my weight in gold.
My husband's a prisoner of the Japs in the Philippines. If he'd had a few more of these shells out in Bataan, maybe he'd still be fighting. Whenever I get a bit tired, I think of him on that death march.
The special needs of women workers were more widely recognized in many vital defense areas. For mothers, child care nurseries. For housekeepers, stores and markets were persuaded to stay open evenings. Hairdressers, dances, movies, sports were more and more made available at the unaccustomed hours required by the Hidden Army. Indeed, in some bands, much of the routine of contemporary living was made easier for the woman war worker than for her stay-at-home sister, because it was concentrated under the one roof. There was no longer the necessity to traipse all over town for her dental appointment, her driver's license, her ration coupons. They were all within a few yards of the assembly line. More and more, the special needs of women workers were realized and met. Oh yes, there was another girl we canvassed for her reason for entering war work.
Why did I take a defense job? That's a funny question. I never thought of that before. Do you have to have a reason? We're in a jam, aren't we? I'm sorry, but you'll have to excuse me. I'm too busy to answer damn fool questions like that.
Somehow that answer pleased us. No sudden emotional urge sent this young woman into war work. No loss of a loved one. No temporary economic embarrassment. No mere yearning for excitement or novelty. Democracy is in a jam. There are millions like her. There will have to be. 18 million women aren't enough. As more men are called for military service, their places must be taken by women. We are forced to face casualties at the front, but never again, as during 1943, can one woman quit for every two who are hired. There's no time to be spent in the constant training of new replacements. Without the help of additional thousands of women, we cannot build the mountains of materiel consumed in global invasion. We cannot make good the millions of man-hours and woman-hours that are lost in a fleeting second's smoke and flame. As long as the Nazi cancer exists anywhere in the world, this is also a woman's war, to be waged so that no woman shall ever again clutch a starved baby to her breast, so that no woman anywhere shall ever be the slave of a fascist state that makes her no more than a brood mare. That is why the women of America, like the men at their side, must flock to war jobs and stick to their jobs until that day when an end has come to the devastation of the earth. When men again may safely go down to the sea in ships. That day when peace has come once more to all lands, and especially to the land at whose gate stands the finest warrior, the greatest woman of them all.
Summer 1945, and the war was 1 million men old. Hang on, kid. Keep your eyes shut tight and drink. They're moving you back now. Don't give up. Just hang on. The road back is bumpy and maybe the pain blurs your eyes. But listen. The sound of battle grows dim. And now one question cuts clearly through the haze. Which man will you be? The one who gets hurt and dies? Or the one who gets hurt and lives? When the dizziness stopped, when the fog cleared, an army nurse was at your side. A woman who meant safety and comfort and home to thousands of men before you. A woman who meant all those things to you. A nurse brought another American's blood to your side to pour new strength into your veins. A nurse handed clamps to the surgeon and counted sponges. A nurse prepared and administered the anesthetic and watched you constantly for any telltale change in your breathing or blood pressure, all working with the same purpose: to ease the pain of war, to help save lives. The preparation for the moment that would bring the Army nurse to your side began months before back home in the United States. After 3 years of professional schooling, the nurses were given 4 weeks of basic training. In those early days, perhaps the nurse wondered why she had to sit through seemingly endless classes and submit to rigid discipline. Often, while muscles ached and groaned, she may have wondered why it was necessary to take those long hikes or grope her way through a gassed area. Yet there were demands that would require of her perfect physical health and stamina, the strength to stand up under the rigors of combat nursing. 4 weeks of basic training finished, the Army nurse was ready to serve wherever the Army needed her most. She might have found herself stationed in a general hospital right here at home, or perhaps assigned to a mobile hospital unit overseas. After she arrived, she may have helped to build the very hospital in which she worked. For the field hospital or the evacuation hospital, like a circus, had to be able to pack up and move on at a moment's notice. Its primary function was to offer immediate surgical treatment to the wounded, and that meant following ever-changing battle lines. Everyone pitched in when a mobile hospital went up: enlisted men, doctors, and nurses. Just one small instance where basic training paid off. Those muscles, toughened and hardened during the 4 weeks of basic back home, were equal to the job. In the field, the Army nurse lived roughly and worked gently. There was no glamour, and her life was far from spectacular. She slept under hastily pitched canvas, on a GI cot, under GI blankets. She trained her mind to act as an alarm clock, because time was important. A wasted moment might have meant a wasted life. She lived a life completely stripped of luxuries, and yet she asked for no more luxury than a patient smile when his pain was eased. She ate regular GI rations the same as the rest of the Army, and often at irregular times. The hours were long and the demands never-ending. And as a result, the nurse learned to make use of every moment of her off-duty time. She might not have chosen a GI helmet to wear to her kid sister's wedding, but it made up for its lack of style by its versatility. It was a beauty parlor, laundry, cooking pot, wash basin, all rolled up into one. A little community in size 7. She spent some of her time writing letters. Not the having a wonderful time, wish you were here kind, but letters filled with all the drama of her days, with stories of the courage and spirit of the men over whom she watched. A few moments could always be found for prayer. Others for lounging about talking of home. She may have longed to wear the evening dress sent from home, but probably only had the chance to talk about it. Usually she wore olive drab or battle gray. Her uniform at all times was her badge of service. But however she spent her off-duty time, she was always eager to return to the hospital where the wounded were fighting for their lives. For first and foremost, and at all times, she was a nurse, offering professional and skilled care to the sick and wounded. A nurse first, a woman second, and an officer third might well serve as the slogan for every member of the Nurses Corps. Complete recovery of the patient in war or peace depends not only upon the use of drugs, but on the skill with which they are administered, and the care that follows. The nurse must be capable of recognizing at once any symptoms in her patients which demand immediate treatment, because if serious consequences are to be avoided, medical treatment must be on hand the moment any symptoms appear. Professionally skilled and capable, in her there is the tenderness of all women, of mother and sister and friend. Her voice and touch lend encouragement, instill hope. It's the surgeon who saves a man's life. It's the nurse whose tender care helps him to live. The crisis past, patients begin to sleep again. The pain is just a bad memory. The field hospital, a stopover to give them immediate surgical treatment as soon as possible after they were wounded, had done its job. The evacuation hospital was another stopover on the trip back through the medical chain. Here, facilities for treatment were more complete than those of the field hospital. And here, too, the nurse played an increasingly important part in the vital period of treatment and convalescence. After 3 or 4 days, the patients were usually well enough for the trip back to the general hospital. Trains waited for them, hospital wards on wheels. Each train carried, in addition to medical officers and enlisted technicians, 4 surgical nurses and 2 medical nurses, all of whom were on duty from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m., and as far into the night as they were needed. When speed meant life, evacuation took place by plane. Because of these flying hospitals, men are alive today who otherwise would have died in the jungles of Burma or on the beaches of Normandy. Each patient was thoroughly checked before the takeoff, then watched over constantly, and checked again when the plane landed. While in the air, the flight nurse was in complete charge, ready to handle every emergency and doing everything a doctor would have to do, except operate. Air evacuation was difficult, and required specialized skill and training. The flight nurse had to be prepared for the unexpected. For the next moment, it might have and often did happen. At the General Hospital in the theater of operation, other skilled teams of surgeons and nurses stood ready to take over where the frontline hospitals left off. Whether a hospital is under canvas out in the field or in a solid structure in a city, its routine, like the nurse's routine, doesn't vary, and its principal aim remains fixed: to offer the best possible medical care to the sick and wounded. Nurses sterilized the operating equipment, the surgical gowns and gloves, prepared drugs, laid out the instruments which the doctor needed for his next operation, and kept accurate records of each patient's history and progress. While in a civilian hospital, the ratio is usually 1 nurse to every 3 beds. In an Army hospital, it is always many times that number. To help lift the burden from the nurse's shoulders, enlisted technicians trained in special schools are assigned to work under her direct supervision. One of her biggest jobs is to teach these technicians both in the classroom and in the hospital wards. This means added responsibility for the nurse, for although she has less personal contact with her patients, she has to direct the activities of the personnel assigned to her, so that the treatment and well-being of her patients is assured. Relaxation and entertainment are an important part of medical treatment. To this general hospital overseas came an all-star show, and the Army nurse shared the fun with her patients, to whom the sound of laughter from home often meant more than medicine. Later on, she may have spent a few minutes with the star. And there were times when she herself was the star of the show, like this nurse, the first woman to land on Bougainville. The umpire calls batter up, and the game is on. Army versus Army, as the nurses play the wax. This infield will never play in the polo grounds, but one of their patients might. Off duty for a while, some nurses strolled through the streets and buildings of ancient cities. Others preferred a round of golf, or a swim somewhere if the weather was right. Then it was always back to duty, back to the sick and wounded, back to the hospital, around which the life of an Army nurse revolves. Those patients scheduled for a trip back home for the final period of convalescence travel on a hospital ship as fully equipped as a stationary hospital. Now, as before, the Army nurse stands by ready to minister to every need. Next stop, a debarkation hospital. Then a general hospital in the United States and complete recovery. And this is the end of the long chain of evacuation, the general hospital back home. Here the Army nurse works patiently with her hands, her head, and her heart. Here she gently guides men back to the way of life they fought to protect. Although she might have volunteered to serve overseas, although she might chafe at what she considered the inactivity of working in a hospital in the United States or Alaska or Panama, the Army nurse soon learned that a battle line was wherever a soldier was stationed. What words of praise can measure up to these women whose very lives are given to nursing sick and wounded men? 1 million sick and wounded men, back to life and health. And yet praise is offered. Long hours of tireless service were remembered and recognized. The Army nurse, decorated for bravery and valor above and beyond the call of duty. And these nurses, imprisoned for 3 long years by the Japanese, asked only that they be returned to duty, for they could never forget the faces of American men tortured and killed by the enemy. Wherever transports took our soldiers, they also took the Army nurse to work by day, by night, on distant battlefields, to help make shattered bodies whole, to bring smiles to faces twisted with pain, to serve at the side of the American soldier during peace and war. This is the Army Nurse USA, ready to serve anywhere, under any circumstances, in time of need.
During the past 4 years, 57,000 graduate registered nurses have served with the medical department of the Army. For us, the war is not yet over. Many nurses are still being sent to overseas theaters to care for American soldiers. These are replacements for nurses who served overseas during the war. And the war is not yet over for many of our patients. More than 300,000 patients are in Army hospitals throughout this country, many of whom will be forced to remain there for a long time to come. These men are not asking for much. They have never asked for much. They are the most wonderful patients in the world. But the war has cost them much more than any of us have been asked to give. Army nurses seldom ask for much either. But today, they are asking you to buy a bond.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Walter Matthau.
You will enter the continent of Europe and in conjunction with the other United Nations undertake operations aimed at the heart of Germany and the destruction of her armed forces. This was without a doubt the most difficult assignment ever given to one man. The brilliance with which he answered this awesome challenge marks him as one of our greatest soldiers. Mr. Raymond Massey, the distinguished actor, now brings you some of the finest moments in our history. The story of General of the Army, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
The time is June 1945. The occasion, the return to his homeland of a war hero whose stature has seldom been matched in the esteem of his countrymen. The European phase of the greatest war America ever fought is over, and part of the warmth with which the people of Abilene, Kansas greet General Dwight D. Eisenhower reflects the deep joy of a nation approaching peace again. Some of it is the kind of welcome any hometown might give a favorite son who has done a good job. But more than anything else, it is a tribute. A gratitude felt in every corner of the Allied world, no less than in Abilene, toward the man who stewarded a crusade to its victory. It was a crusade with many battles and many triumphs, but it found its symbol in one day above all others. D-Day, June the 6th, 1944. The invasion of Fortress Europe was one of the greatest military adventures of all time. Upon the outcome of this bold adventure hung the fate of war and freedom. It was because so much of man's hope had been bound up in the success of this adventure that the architect of that success found the hearts of the people open to him from Europe to the town of his boyhood, where the adventure of Dwight D. Eisenhower, the man, began. Abilene, Kansas, today, a busy and proud town of almost 7,000 people living in the heart of the western wheatland, is typical of the kind of town that comes to mind with the phrase grassroots America. The mark of the past is on it, but it does not live in the past. Its streets and its buildings bear testimony to a living and growing America. One of its newest and proudest buildings is the Eisenhower Museum, which carries forth the spirit and the history of the Eisenhower family of Abilene. It is visited daily by citizens from all parts of the country, ranging from dignitary to schoolboy. Inside the museum, the life of Dwight Eisenhower, boy and man, is depicted in a series of murals. From infancy, that life had the flavor of grassroots America about it. Eisenhower was born in 1890 in Denison, Texas, of parents whose families had migrated to Pennsylvania from Europe and thence to the American Midwest. Young Eisenhower's parents had lived in Abilene before his birth, and it was to Abilene, once the wild town at the end of the Chisholm Trail, now a peaceful village of the plains, that they returned when he was an infant. And it was here that he grew to maturity through a childhood that was active, eager, and happy. An experience shared with devoted parents and spirited brothers. A childhood as rich in the important things of life as ever graced the development of any man. It was an active boyhood in which sports played an important part. He excelled at baseball, both in school and on a vacant lot next to his home. But football was his first love, and his high school coach called him the most outstanding tackle in the valley. The active life was important, but the greatest single staple of the Eisenhower family life was religious observance. The family home in Abilene shows the influence of that serious religious conviction. The Bible was the guide of family life, and its chronicler as well. On the wall of the bedroom shared by Dwight and his brother Edgar still hangs this simple testament of faith, "Thy will be done." It was a home of patriotism as well as faith, and of respect for things of the mind. Work, constant and hard work, was also a staple of the family routine. The creamery where young Eisenhower worked during his spare time while he was in school is still one of Abilene's light industries. In this way, and by these standards, young Dwight Eisenhower grew to a manhood the world would one day know well. He was 20 when he left Abilene for the military academy at West Point. Many a great American has begun his march into history as a cadet on the plane at West Point. Eisenhower was graduated from the military academy in 1915 and commissioned a second lieutenant of infantry. A new phase of life was beginning. In the summer of 1916, as a newly promoted first lieutenant stationed at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, he married Mamie Geneva Dowd of Denver. Events in Europe were forging a new phase of life for the entire world. World War I gave many a future general his first experience with combat. But young Eisenhower was not among them. World War I brought him instead command of a tank training center at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where he prepared troops of the new tank corps for overseas duty. His performance won for him the Distinguished Service Medal. But before he was able to get to Europe, the war ended. In the late 1920s, after graduation from the Command and General Staff School, Major Dwight D. Eisenhower was assigned to France to prepare a guidebook on American battlefields in Europe. It was his first direct experience with that continent. With the 30s came other assignments, climaxed by service under General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines. For 4 years, he worked with MacArthur, who was Commander-in-Chief of the Philippine Army, to help the Commonwealth government work out a plan for its military defense. Ordered back to the States in December 1939, Lieutenant Colonel Eisenhower went to Fort Lewis, Washington, as executive officer of the 15th Infantry Regiment. In the dark spring of 1940, German armored divisions were crashing through Holland and Belgium. The Luftwaffe was streaking its destruction through Europe's skies. France was prostrate, and beleaguered Britain was standing alone. The United States had passed the Selective Service Act to prepare for what inevitably lay ahead. And the biggest challenge in Colonel Eisenhower's life was to aid in that preparation. Late in 1940, he was made Chief of Staff of the 3rd Division, where his staff work brought him assignment as Chief of Staff of the 9th Corps. In the summer of 1941, Colonel Eisenhower became Chief of Staff to General Walter Kruger, whose newly organized 3rd Army was preparing to participate in the most realistic war maneuvers yet held by American troops. In these maneuvers over the Louisiana countryside, as America fought for the time to train its growing army of citizen soldiers, Eisenhower's task was to work out a plan of defense against an invading mechanized force. Soon after the maneuvers were over, Eisenhower was promoted to Brigadier General, and within a matter of days came the bombing of Pearl Harbor. From almost this moment on, the fate of the nation and the fate of General Dwight D. Eisenhower would be inextricably bound together. Called to Washington in the first weeks after the war began, Eisenhower went to work in the War Plans Office of the War Department. Among the plans formulated during this time was the central strategic determination to make an eventual attack across the English Channel the principal Allied offensive effort. A mural covering the west wall of the Eisenhower Museum dramatizes the high spots of the next great sequence in the adventure involving the nation and the man, whose ability to rise to grave responsibilities brought him rapid promotions. Because an all-out Channel invasion would be impossible before 1944, and because the need for offensive action was immediate in 1942, the Allies undertook, as a combined operation, under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the invasion of North Africa. The minimum objective of this maneuver was to seize the main ports between Casablanca and Algiers. Along the rim of the North African coast, troops were ashore in late November, encountering resistance ranging from mild at Algiers to surprisingly stiff at Casablanca. The commander's hope was to push quickly east along the Mediterranean and take the important posts of Bizerte and Tunis. But a number of unfavorable circumstances, including treacherous weather conditions, prompted the commander to hold off on this vital assault. In the spring, however, troops of Omar Bradley's 2nd Corps were able to take Bizerte, and at the same time, Tunis fell to the British First Army. And with these victories came the end of the Axis Empire in Africa. The Allied leaders and the men who had fought under them proudly commemorated their victory. One of the greatest products of this victory, in the words of the commander himself, was the progress achieved in the welding of Allied unity and the establishment of a combat team that was already showing the effects of a growing confidence and trust among all its members. The successful end of the campaign brought personal recognition of Eisenhower throughout the world as a great leader. But the commander himself interpreted this recognition as proof that free men can find in unity the way to victory, even against seemingly invincible odds. The next big campaign, the invasion of Sicily, brought further demonstration of this basic truth. Allied troops took this vital rock in the summer of 1943. The effect of Sicily's fall was electric. Italy surrendered, the first of the Axis partners to capitulate. And now the Allies prepared for what was to be the most fiercely fought battle of the Mediterranean War. The invasion of Italy itself at Salerno. Through a miracle of courage and tenacity, troops of General Mark Clark's 5th Army established a beachhead against overwhelming German odds and went on to take Salerno and the vital port of Naples. With these victories, although heavy fighting and important battles lay ahead, the first major objectives of the Italian campaign were accomplished. Allied forces were on European soil and would be able to pin down German troops far from the scene of the cross-channel invasion planned for the following year. President Roosevelt visited the combat area with General Eisenhower when he came over for the Cairo and Tehran conferences, where agreement was once again established that the principal Allied effort would be the invasion of Europe. Shortly afterward, the man who would command this awesome undertaking was named General Dwight D. Eisenhower, whom people throughout the free world were now calling the man of the hour. On the opposite wall of the museum, another mural depicts some of the major episodes in the Great Crusade, which liberated Europe. The Supreme Commander's orders from the combined Chiefs of Staff were quite simple: to land on the coast of France and thereafter to destroy the German ground forces. Between the order and its execution lay an agony of effort. Across the Channel, the heavy fortifications lining the coast of France bespoke the Nazis' belief that they could push the invading armies back into the sea. In France alone, 58 German divisions were waiting. Preparing for the invasion was a job without let-up. Incessant and realistic training was of paramount importance. The challenges of morale, the myriad details of coordination on every level, all these were overwhelming. But through those tense months in the early part of 1944, the preparations continued. And And finally, after being postponed one day because of weather conditions, the eve of the day of decision was at hand. The commander visited the airborne troops who would lead the invasion. I found the men in fine fettle, he wrote later, joshingly admonishing me that I had no cause for worry. D-Day, with the fate of the war hanging in the balance. Half a million troops, backed by millions more, faced outward across the stormy sea. On beaches that dotted the French coast of the Channel, British, Canadian, and American troops touched shore. The first fateful moment passed, and Allied troops were holding on French soil. 1 week after the landings, the commander was able to say to the vast armies under him, "Your accomplishments in the last 7 days of this campaign have exceeded my highest hopes." Less than 2 months after the invasion, the Allied force broke out of the beachhead perimeter in the hedgerow country around St. Lo. Exploitation of the breakout was the next step. And now there began the dramatic pursuit, spearheaded by General George S. Patton's armored force across the heart of France. And then the grand triumphant march through Paris, which was freed by French troops and soldiers of the U.S. 5th Corps. Beyond Paris lay the liberation of Belgium and the yard-by-yard struggle across the German border. Blocking the steady pursuit of victory lay the Nazi counteroffensive in the Ardennes sector, known as the Battle of the Bulge. Through a grim and bleak period of several weeks, the enemy, supported by the most devastating of weather conditions, isolated and assaulted Allied forces. General Eisenhower called upon all troops to rise to new heights of courage and effort. The brave men of the beleaguered forces held and steadily began pressing the enemy back. And from that moment onward, the Supreme Commander counted on weakened Nazi resistance. The bridge at Remagen across the Rhine, one of the sturdiest symbols of the war. With its crossing in March 1945, the heart of the enemy's defenses was cracked. There remained the substantial task of mopping up what was left of the enemy west of the Rhine. And accepting his surrender in the droves that began to appear. The great cities of the enemy's fatherland were rubble as Allied troops moved through them in the last stages of the enemy's defeat. Both commander and GI were able to find the exultation that comes when victory is close. Victory came finally with the German surrender in a schoolhouse at Reims on May the 7th, 1945. The return to peace was signaled by the Supreme Commander.
I have the proud privilege of speaking for a victorious army of almost 5 million fighting men. They and the women who have so ably assisted them constitute the Allied expeditionary forces that have liberated Western Europe. They have captured or destroyed enemy armies totaling more than their own strength. Merely to name my principal subordinates in the Canadian, French, American, and British forces is to present a picture of the utmost in efficiency, skill, loyalty, and devotion to duty. The United Nations will gratefully remember Tedder, Montgomery, Spatz, Bradley, DeLotte, Creer, and many others. But all these agree with me in the selection of the truly heroic figure of this war. He is G.I. Joe and his counterpart in the air, the Navy, and the merchant marine of every one of the United Nations. He has braved the dangers of U-boat infested seas. He has surmounted charges into desperately defended beaches. He has fought his tedious, patient way through the ultimate in fortified zones. He has endured cold, hunger, fatigue. His companion has been danger. Death has dogged his footsteps. He and his platoon commanders have given us an example of loyalty, devotion to duty, and indomitable courage that will live in our hearts as long as we admire those qualities in men.
And now the long and happy road home. For Dwight Eisenhower, that road was paved with the cheers of the people of the Allied countries. In his own homeland, a hero's welcome awaited him. America's greeting for a favorite son. Here, the story of Dwight D. Eisenhower might well have ended, on this note of triumphant acclaim for a job so splendidly done. But America had other tasks waiting for its favorite soldier. Eisenhower succeeded General Marshall as the Army's first post-war chief of staff. He expressed the belief that one of the greatest pillars of world peace is a strong United States. He visited troops stationed in various parts of the world to show America's growing sense of global responsibility. We must remain, he said, the first champions of those who seek to lead their own lives in peace with their neighbors. Finally, on February the 7th, 1948, the general from Abilene, after 36 years of service to his country, left active military assignment. But not active participation in the life of his nation. He accepted an invitation from Columbia University to serve as president of that great institution, enabling him, so he thought at the time, to devote the remainder of his useful life to the challenges of education. But events of the post-war world dictated otherwise. The urgent necessity for unity in the free world brought into being the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And it was evident that only one man could make that vital and complicated organization work from the outset. Dwight D. Eisenhower. At the end of 1950, he answered his country's call once more. And once more, he was on European soil to assume supreme command of the land, the sea, and the air forces of a grand defensive alliance. Against the new threat rising from the Soviets, who had once been his nation's ally, he had to create in the war-weary European soul the will to defend itself, so that freedom so dearly bought would not be lost. For more than a year, he labored diligently at his task of coalition. When he turned over the reins of command to General Matthew Ridgway, the structure of military unity among free nations, on which rested the hope for continued peace, was established. Once again, with the accomplishment of substantial victory behind him, this might well have been the end of his public career, and in a sense it was. The closing chapter in the story of Eisenhower the soldier. History is recording today the story of Eisenhower the statesman. The stories may be separate, but soldier and statesman, they are the same man, Dwight D. Eisenhower, citizen of the United States, spokesman for and symbol of the free world. And son of Abilene. As rich a study as this nation has produced of the capacity for greatness which lies at its grassroots.
Fellow Americans, consider the skies of Michigan. These airy heights, these swift bird flights, these children's kites. How peaceful the skies of Michigan. Here is the city of Grand Rapids, Michigan, furniture center of the USA. Population came of Holland Dutch, French and Canadian, Polish, Irish, and Lithuanian. Population is 168,000 Americans. A little frontier trading post manufactured itself into a city. Gone are the Grand River log jams and big men driving the timber down. But even now, Grand Rapids is sawing it up and sanding it down and gluing it up and carving it down and making it up into furniture. Now, a few weeks ago, one ordinary Grand Rapids day, a bomb fell. Yes, here in Grand Rapids, a bomb fell on the furniture center of the USA. Someone was killed, someone of Grand Rapids. As the bomb fell, these kids were shooting marbles for keeps. They didn't see it. As the bomb struck, the junior league was playing bridge. They didn't feel it hit. Where the bomb exploded was here, 726 Reed Street. It blew up here. Funny, nobody saw it, nobody heard it, nobody knew it fell. Nobody in Grand Rapids knew a bomb had fallen on the city. Not the boys in the barber shop, not the Schubert Singing Club, not the city tournament bowlers, not even the mayor at the Lions Club. Nobody. But a few days later, they knew. Earlier that day, a bomb fell on Grand Rapids, Michigan, USA.
After exhaustive search, it has been found impossible to locate your son, Raymond D. Boynton, Seaman Second Class, United States Navy. And he has therefore been officially declared to have lost his life in the service of his country as of December 7, 1941. The department expresses to you its sincerest sympathy.
Fellow Americans, and now to the shores of Florida. Her sunshine days, her Spanish ways, her azure bays. How peaceful the shores of Florida. Now here is the city of Tampa, Florida. Tobacco port, winter resort. Tampa is 101,000 Floridians, exporting timber and turpentine, shipping 90% of Florida's grapefruit, making cigars. Some of them can tell you about the Florida boom, 1924. A lot of promoters went broke. About Hernando de Soto, 1539. They say he sat under this oak. About the Rough Riders, 1898, time when this gun spoke. Old-timers remember about how Tampa sang, "There'll be a hot time in the old town tonight." Funny, though, some of them don't know how a few weeks ago, Tampa was machine gunned from the air. Tampa went on shopping. Tampa went on playing. Tampa went on being a winter resort and a tobacco port. Tampa University didn't hear. Franklin Street didn't notice. The Yacht Club and the City Hall, they didn't know about it. But here, 2803 Fountain Boulevard, they knew. Tampa had been machine gunned.
The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your son, Private Theodore F. Byrd, Jr., United States Army Air Corps, was killed in action in defense of his country in the Hawaiian Islands, December 7. Letter follows.
Fellow Americans, and here are the towers of New York, of commerce rise, of enterprise, of breathless sighs. How peaceful the towers of New York. Here then is New York City, hometown of 7 million. New Amsterdam, harbor of ships and fleets. Manhattan, metropolis of the world. Subway to skyline. Tenement to penthouse. Workshop to play shop. Metropolis of the world. So clever, so able, so brilliant, so knowing. Except did not know, did not feel, did not hear the torpedo that struck New York. Yes, deadly. Nobody saw it crossing Times Square to a movie. Nobody felt it shopping on Fifth Avenue, or was hit lunching at the Rainbow Room. Just the same, a torpedo struck New York. 319 East 100th Street, Manhattan Island. And they knew it had happened.
The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your son, Sergeant Joseph J. Chagnon, United States Army, was killed in action in defense of his country in the Hawaiian Islands, December 7. Letter follows.
Fellow Americans, consider the ranges of Texas, her open spaces, her crowded places, her western faces. How peaceful the ranges of Texas. Here at Port Arthur, Texas, near Louisiana and the sea, 46,000 Texans say, "We oil the world." Proud of the Lone Star State. Young city going places. No war on the pleasure pier. College girls swimming. Sabine Lake fishing. Boat sailing. And holding hands. Woodworth Boulevard. Nice homes. Gates Memorial Library. Brand new. Port Arthur College for learning to work. Looks peaceful. Too peaceful for war. But it's here in Port Arthur. Dive bombers? Yes, here. Killed someone at Port Arthur. A hometown boy. Grew up with the other kids. Graduated Thomas Jefferson High last June. When the dive bomber struck, didn't hit the news building or the firehouse. Didn't frighten the Watkins family. Didn't shatter the cigar store. Where it struck, where they knew, was here, 525 New Orleans Avenue.
Deeply regret to inform you that your son, Private Robert A. Huval, United States Marine Corps, died of wounds received in the performance of his duty and in the service of his trade. To prevent possible aid to our enemies, please do not divulge the name of his ship or station.
Please accept my heartfelt sympathy.
It's here in our America. Bombardment, shell fire, death, destruction. Can you see it? Can you hear it? Listen. Fellow Americans, give them your answer.
Hello, America. This is John B. Hughes speaking. I just completed a trip across the country, getting one of the most amazing war stories of 1943. It's your story, America. I'm going to give it to you just the way it was told to me. In 1943, American ingenuity developed the most terrifying war weapons ever conceived by man. But one of the mightiest weapons produced in 1943 received little publicity. It was not built in the booming war plants. It was forged by the people of a little town in Indiana, by the people of another little town in Iowa. It was produced in hundreds of teeming cities. What is this weapon we cannot see, yet which is so vital to victory? It is American food, perhaps the most potent war weapon ever forged in the arsenal of democracy. In 1943, 6 million American farmers broke all food production records for the 7th straight year.
Oh, Mr. Harvey.
How do you do?
I've come out here to try to get the story of how the American farmers beat production records in 43.
Oh, shucks, mister, it's not much of a story.
Oh, no. What about the farm manpower shortage, and the lack of new machinery and parts, and the floods, and 100 other handicaps that could have licked you?
Reckon we just outstubborn them.
Well, I'd like to hear about it, and so will the American people.
Well, sure, if it's really important. First thing our local farm committeemen told us was what kinds of food the country needed and why. The farmers were asked to plant 364 million acres in 43. That meant a big increase for all of us. They wanted lots more special war crops, too. Well, we plotted out our land and went to work. It was mostly 12 to 16 hours a day and no days off. But we figured our own farm boys were doing a lot more over there. Neighbor helped neighbor, and our women and kids pitched in with the men. Those quotas had to be met. There was no time to lose. You can't shut down a farm like you can a war factory, then start her up again. We had our troubles naturally, but when we couldn't get spare tractor parts, we used baling wire. Then there were floods that washed out our seed, but we planted more. There wasn't enough feed supplied, and there was no feed to buy or fertilizer or tools, but we managed all right. We had our own victory gardens, too. They fed our families, sort of helped ease the country shortage.
6 million farm victory gardens on top of everything else. Don't you people ever get tired?
Not with this war to be won.
Okay, Mr. Harvey. So there's just one more miracle to explain. We've all heard about the farm manpower shortage. What did you do for labor in harvest time?
Well, I reckon that's Bob Hopkins' story, mister. He runs the main store in Midvale.
Sure, we were busy here, but we weren't too busy to help the farmers. Neither were plenty of other towns like Midvale. Those farmers are the men who feed the men who feed the guns. Well, first off, our small town newspapers all over the country donated space, and our movie theaters volunteered to run special slides telling folks how much they is needed to help with harvesting the crops. We fired our appeal at the housewives, who could usually give a few hours a day, at businessmen who could spare an employee 1 or 2 afternoons a week, at teenage kids who could earn good summer vacation money on farms. Then we used the radio to carry our message to city people.
Next week, the berry crop will be ready to pick, the biggest crop in the history of this county. Our farmers are short of workers to harvest this vital crop. No time can be lost. Your help is needed.
We wanted working girls who couldn't go anywhere for their vacations. City boys who'd be better off on farms than playing in tenement streets. Boy Scouts and campfire girls. It was wonderful how those Americans came from the towns and the cities. Most of them had never worked on farms before, but they went at it like beavers to get the crops out. They got good housing, good food, and a new lease on health. Well, sir, it's hard to believe, but in 1943, more than 4 million volunteers worked on American farms and in the processing plants. There's a big processing plant near here, but last year, only 100 workers showed up when they needed 4 times that many. So they came for help. Our wives left their bridge tables to answer the call. Our merchants closed their stores to help. We even let the kids out of school. Something that didn't exactly break their hearts. Maybe we didn't know much about the food processing business, but we soon learned. And that's one example of what happened all over the nation in 43. No wonder this country's never been licked.
And it never will be with spirit like that. Well, I'm off to get the story of our victory gardeners. Uncle Sam asked for 18 million gardens in 1943 and got 20 million.
Sure, we all had them around here. I understand they did a good job in the cities, too, and why it's a whole lot harder to raise vegetables.
Well, I'm going to find out how they did it. I have an appointment with the mayor of your biggest city.
Yes, Mr. Hughes, even the mayor has to find time to do his share these days. Our city is mighty proud of its 257,468 victory gardens. They supplied a good half of our vegetables in 1943, not to mention the amount of vital transportation they saved. You'll find their gardens growing among our very skyscrapers and in almost every backyard with a foot of available space. Victory gardening is the greatest voluntary movement on the home front, and the gardener who becomes discouraged and gives up is letting down his country. What if the farmer gave up? Mr. Hughes, the American victory gardener is the man behind the farmer. In 1943, he produced almost half the country's vegetable crop, or approximately 8 million tons of food worth $500 million.
Mr. Mayor, every man, woman, and child who picked up a hoe last year was a real soldier on the home front.
Definitely.
Well, I've got my story on the farmer, the volunteer worker, and the victory gardener. Food was indeed one of our most potent weapons in 43. And here's what they produced. Enough eggs, if laid end to end, to reach the moon 7 times. Enough milk, perhaps the most necessary food of all, to float the navies of the United Nations. Enough meat to pave 8 4-lane superhighways from New York to San Francisco, 1 inch thick. Enough cases of canned tomatoes to reach from Boston to Bombay, India. Corn acreage equal to the area of Japan proper. The war is far from won. Yes, how about 1944 in terms of our fighting food? Do you know, America, that it requires a ton of food a year to feed every man in our armed forces? That every fighting man on the battlefronts has a 9-4 will see nearly twice as many Americans overseas. Do you know that besides all this, the average American civilian eats 2/3 of a ton a year? Then there are your fighting allies, those people who have been holding and beating back the enemy for years and are still beating him back. Also, there will be many more liberated in 1944, and they too must be fed if you are to have their friendship and cooperation. Your military leaders want no starving people behind their battle lines, for a hungry man is a dangerous man. These people don't want to be fed forever. They ask only a small part of your food to put them on their feet again. In 1944, even greater convoys must carry your food to the far corners of the world. There will be many precious cargoes that will never reach their destination. Yes, America, you did a great job in 43, but the food battle for 44 will be even greater. What are you going to do about it?
The country expects the farmers to plant 380 million acres this year, 16 million more than in 1943. That's a mighty big order. But Uncle Sam isn't fooling about needing that extra food. And we're not fooling when we say we'll produce it.
We're going to need nearly 5 million volunteers to work on farms and in processing plants this year. That's a good 500,000 more than in 43. It means that 2,500,000 will have to come from the cities. We're appealing mostly to the women and the kids in the city schools. Well, they'll come all right. They're Americans.
The American people have been asked to plant 22 million victory gardens in 1944, an increase of 2 million. We know now how much these gardens mean to the war effort, and this city's rolling up its sleeves and going to work.
Those are the answers your Uncle Sam likes, America. You've heard the amazing food production story of 1943, and the even more amazing job that must be done in 44. It's up to you, America. The plow line is the battle line, but the farmer can't do it alone. Let's get behind him, all of us, and make American food fight for freedom.